A dying western town was tearing itself apart over a single drop of water when a mysterious rider appeared from the desert with a black horse that seemed to sense something no one else could. The people of Dry Creek thought the drought was killing them, but the real danger hiding in town was fear, greed, and the terrible things desperate people become. One father would die trying to steal water for his son, and one secret buried beneath the western hills would change the town forever. But the strangest part wasn't the hidden river. It was the way the rider's horse kept staring into the darkness, like it already knew the truth. Some said the rider was cursed. Others believed God had sent him to remind broken people how to be human again. And before the sun rose over Dry Creek one final time, revenge, mercy, and hope would stand face to face beneath the sound of flowing water. Before we begin tonight's journey, tell me where you're watching from. And if you love emotional Western stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ride with us into the next story. The heat came down on the Texas desert like a punishment from God. It bent the air above the red dirt road, turned the distant hills into wavering ghosts, and pressed silence over the land until even the insects seemed too tired to sing. Along that road came a tall black horse named Ghost, its dark mane tangled by wind and dust, its strong body moving with the slow patience of an animal that had crossed too many hard miles to complain. A small white mark rested on its forehead like a faded star. In the saddle sat the rider, a tall, lean cowboy with broad shoulders and the worn posture of a man who had survived more than he ever spoke of. His dark Stetson was pulled low, shading cold, observant eyes. Messy dark hair brushed against his weathered face, and a rough beard covered his jaw. A red-brown bandana hung at his neck, dusty from the trail. His long leather coat shifted with each movement of the horse, revealing a black vest, dark denim, leather gloves, an engraved silver belt buckle, and two old Colt .45 revolvers resting quietly in their holsters. He did not look like a hero riding toward trouble. He looked like trouble had followed him for years and finally grown tired. Dry Creek appeared near sunset, though appeared was too generous a word. The town rose out of the dust like something half buried and ashamed of still standing. The windmill by the entrance did not turn. Its broken blades creaked once, then stopped, like a dying man trying to speak. A dead steer lay near a fence post, ribs sharp beneath sunken hide, and 3 buzzards watched from the roof of an abandoned stable. The rider slowed Ghost but did not stop. His eyes moved over shuttered windows, cracked water barrels, empty troughs, and faces peering from behind curtains. There had been laughter here once. You could feel it in the shape of the street, in the faded sign above the saloon, in the schoolhouse bell that still hung at the far end of town. But drought had a way of taking more than water. It took music first, then kindness, then the courage to look your neighbor in the eye. A boy of about 12 stood outside the general store with a tin cup in both hands. He was thin, sunburned, and barefoot, with sandy hair sticking to his forehead and eyes too sharp for his age. His name, though the rider did not yet know it, was Caleb Morris, the son of a carpenter who had left town 2 weeks earlier to search for work and had not returned. Caleb watched Ghost more than the man in the saddle, as children often did when they sensed an animal was safer than people. "That horse looks better fed than half the town," he muttered. His voice carried no hatred, only the bitter honesty hunger teaches early. The rider glanced down at him, then at the empty cup. He said nothing. Silence for him was not rudeness. It was a fence built around things too ruined to show. At the center of town, 2 men stood beside a dry public trough, arguing over a dented canteen. One was short and thick through the chest, with a red face and a tobacco-stained mustache. The other was taller, hollow-cheeked, and shaking from thirst or anger, maybe both. Their voices rose quickly. The shorter man shoved first, the taller one swung back, and the canteen fell, spilling no more than a mouthful of water into the dirt. Both men froze. Around them, the whole street seemed to hold its breath. That tiny, dark patch in the dust looked more valuable than blood. Then the short man dropped to his knees and tried to scoop mud into his mouth. No one laughed. No one helped. The rider watched the scene with eyes that did not change, though something inside him tightened. He had seen men fight over gold, land, women, pride, and whiskey, but water made men honest. It showed what they feared losing most, not life, but the last proof they were still human. He dismounted outside the Dry Creek Saloon. The place had once been painted green, but the sun had stripped it into a sickly gray. Inside, the air smelled of stale tobacco, sweat, and old wood baking from the inside out. Behind the bar stood a broad-shouldered woman in her late 40s named Sarah Bell, though most in town called her Miss Bell, out of respect and fear in equal measure. She was tall, with strong arms, copper-brown skin weathered by years beneath the western sun, and dark hair streaked with silver pinned carelessly behind her head. Her face was handsome in a hard way, with deep lines around the mouth from years of holding back, words that might get weaker people killed. Once, people said, Sarah had sung ballads on Saturday nights, while her husband played fiddle beside her. But her husband had died of fever during the first dry summer, and the song had gone out of her after that. Since then, she had become the kind of woman who poured whiskey like medicine and listened to secrets without promising forgiveness. She looked at the rider's guns, then his face, then the dust on his coat. "Passing through?" she asked. Her voice was low and dry, like paper near flame. The rider removed one glove slowly and placed a coin on the bar. "For the horse," he said. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Water's not cheap here." Never asked if it was. She studied him again, noticing the way he stood with his weight balanced, not threatening, but ready. Men who wanted violence leaned forward. Men who feared violence leaned back. This one did neither. That bothered her more than the guns. She took the coin, reached beneath the counter, and filled a small bucket from a covered barrel. "1 bucket," she said, "and don't let folks see you waste it." The rider carried it outside and set it before Ghost. The horse lowered its head, drank slowly, then stopped halfway and lifted its ears toward the west. That was when the first strange thing happened. Ghost did not finish the water. A trail horse did not refuse water in a thirsty town unless something in the air had spoken to it. The black horse raised its head, nostrils widening, and stared beyond the last row of buildings toward the low hills where the evening light burned red. The rider followed its gaze. There was nothing out there but dust, rock, and dying grass. Still, Ghost took one step in that direction, then another, dragging the reins from the rider's loose hand. On the porch, Sarah Bell stopped wiping a glass. Caleb, still holding his empty cup, turned pale. "Animals been doing that," the boy whispered, looking west. "Dogs, too, then they come back quiet." The rider looked at him. "What's west?" Caleb swallowed. "Harper Land." At the mention of that name, the saloon seemed to grow colder despite the heat. Before the rider could ask more, the church bell rang once from the far end of town. Not the clean ringing of Sunday service, but a cracked, desperate sound. A door opened across the street, and a thin woman with a shawl over her head stepped out carrying a child too weak to cry. She moved like someone walking through a dream. Her lips cracked, her eyes unfocused. Behind her, neighbors watched from shadows but did not approach. Shame held them still, fear held them tighter. Sarah came out from the saloon and cursed under her breath. "Martha Reed," she said, "her baby's been sick 3 days." The mother stumbled near the dry trough, looked toward the Harper Water Office at the north end of town, and then sank to her knees. No one moved for a long second. The rider did. He took the bucket from Ghost, still half full, and carried it to her. Martha looked up, her face narrow and gray, her brown hair stuck to her temples. She was not old, perhaps 30, but thirst had carved age into her overnight. "I can't pay," she whispered. The rider placed the bucket in front of her. Wasn't selling. The act was small, but in Dry Creek, small mercies had become dangerous. A man watching from beside the barber shop spat into the dirt. "You give water away here, stranger. You'll have the whole town begging." The speaker was Deputy Earl Pike, a narrow-faced man in his 30s with a patchy blonde beard, pale eyes, and the restless cruelty of someone who had been weak most of his life and finally found a badge to hide behind. His shirt was clean compared to the others, his gun belt polished, his expression full of borrowed authority. The rider turned his head just enough to see him. "Then maybe the town's thirsty." A few people looked down quickly, afraid to be seen agreeing. Deputy Pike's jaw tightened, but he did not draw. Something in the rider's stillness advised against it. As the sun dropped lower, Dry Creek settled into a silence that did not feel like peace. It felt like a loaded gun on a table. The rider led Ghost to the hitching rail outside the saloon, though the horse kept glancing west, ears flicking, body tense beneath the dusty saddle. Sarah Bell watched them from the doorway. "You best leave at first light," she said. "This town has a way of making decent men choose sides." The rider ran one gloved hand along Ghost's neck, feeling the animal's heartbeat under warm skin. "I'm not decent," he said. Sarah almost smiled, but sadness stopped it halfway. "Then maybe you'll fit right in." Night came slowly, bleeding purple over the rooftops. Somewhere, a child coughed. Somewhere else, a woman prayed in a voice too tired for hope. The rider stood alone beside Ghost and looked down the main street of Dry Creek. He had ridden into towns before that were dying. Some died from bullets, some from greed, some from bad luck. But this place felt different. The land was dry, yes, but the fear in the people was wetter than rain, soaking everything, rotting them from within. He thought of leaving. He always thought of leaving. A man without a home survived by not mistaking a roof for belonging. But Ghost shifted again, staring west into the darkening hills, and the rider felt the old pull in his chest, the one he hated, the one that came whenever suffering tried to hide itself behind silence. By morning, he told himself, he would ride on. But even as he thought it, the town bell gave another weak, broken sound, and from somewhere beyond the hills came the faintest noise, almost swallowed by the wind. Moving water. Morning arrived without mercy. The sun climbed over Dry Creek like a fire being dragged slowly across the sky, and before the light had fully settled over the rooftops, people were already gathering near the Harper water station at the north end of town. The building had once been a grain warehouse, before the drought years transformed it into the most important place in Dry Creek. Now thick chains wrapped around its side doors, and two armed men stood watch beside stacked barrels, stamped with the faded blue symbol of the Harper Ranch. The rider watched from across the street while Ghost stood beside him, black ears twitching at every raised voice and nervous movement. The horse looked restless this morning, shifting its weight more than usual, as if it disliked the smell of fear spreading through the crowd. Men, women, and children waited in line beneath the growing heat, with buckets, tin cans, broken kettles, and empty bottles. No one spoke louder than necessary. Hunger made people angry. Thirst made them suspicious. A woman near the back clutched a small bucket to her chest, like someone protecting gold. Another man hid a flask inside his coat every time someone glanced his way. In Dry Creek, nobody trusted thirst anymore, not in themselves, and certainly not in others. Sheriff Tom Hale stood near the front entrance of the station with one hand resting on his revolver. He was a broad, aging man in his early 50s with tired gray eyes and a thick mustache beginning to yellow from years of tobacco. His sheriff's coat hung loosely on his heavy frame, sweat darkening the fabric beneath his arms despite the early hour. Tom Hale had once been respected across 3 counties. Years ago, before the droughts and cattle sickness, he had been known as a steady lawman who rarely drew his weapon because he rarely needed to. But time had worn him down. People could see it in the way he avoided eye contact now, in the hesitation before he spoke, in the exhaustion sitting permanently behind his eyes. The drought had not broken him all at once. It had done it slowly, one hopeless morning at a time. Beside him stood Deputy Earl Pike, cleaner and sharper than everyone else as always, his pale blonde beard trimmed too carefully for a starving town. Pike carried himself with stiff authority, constantly adjusting his gun belt so people would notice it. He liked power because he had spent most of his younger years without any. Folks said his father drank himself to death after losing the family ranch, and Earl had grown into the kind of man who confused fear with respect. He watched the crowd with narrow, suspicious eyes, eager for someone to cause trouble. The rider leaned against the hitching post outside Sarah Bell's saloon, while Ghost drank from a small wooden trough. He had barely slept. Around midnight he had heard whispers outside the saloon walls, arguments between neighbors accusing each other of stealing water in the dark. Once, a bottle shattered somewhere down the street, followed by a woman crying. Dry Creek did not rest anymore. It endured. Sarah Bell stepped out beside him carrying a metal coffee pot. "You still here?" she muttered, pouring black coffee into a chipped cup. "Thought drifters preferred leaving before sunrise." Her face looked harder in daylight. Deep lines cut across her copper-brown skin, and silver strands escaped from her tied-back hair. But there was intelligence in her eyes, the kind built from surviving disappointment too many times to count. The rider accepted the cup with a slight nod. "Thought I'd wait for the heat to get worse." Sarah snorted quietly. "Then you picked the right town." Across the street, the line suddenly shifted. A boy no older than 8 had been caught trying to fill a second bottle from a public barrel after receiving his ration. Deputy Pike grabbed him hard by the collar and yanked him backward. The child dropped instantly into panic, apologizing before the deputy even spoke. His name was Daniel Weaver, a small, dark-haired boy with bruised knees and a split lip that looked days old. Fear had made him thin. Pike shook the extra bottle in his face. "Rules are rules," he barked loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Everybody gets one ration." Daniel stammered through dry lips. "My sister's sick." Pike didn't care. Men like Pike stopped hearing excuses after enough years around desperation. Before the deputy could shove the boy away, Sheriff Hale stepped in. "That's enough, Earl." His voice carried fatigue more than authority, but Pike reluctantly released the child. Daniel stumbled backward and nearly fell before a small figure caught the bottle for him. It was Ellie. The little girl stood there in a faded cream-colored dress, stained with dust near the hem. Her brown hair had been tied loosely behind her head, though strands constantly escaped into her face whenever the wind rose. She looked small beside the adults, but there was a stubborn steadiness in her eyes that didn't belong to a child. The rider recognized her immediately from the previous night. She picked up the bottle and handed it back to Daniel carefully, as if water itself might break if handled too roughly. "You should go home," Pike snapped at her. Ellie ignored him completely. That surprised the rider more than the shouting. Most adults in Dry Creek feared authority now, even weak authority. But Ellie moved through the town with the strange courage only children and fools possessed. The courage of people who had not yet fully learned hopelessness. She noticed Ghost before she noticed the rider. The black horse lowered its head slightly as she approached, nostrils flaring softly. Ellie smiled for the first time all morning and reached toward the animal carefully. Ghost did not move away. "Does he remember people?" she asked quietly. The rider studied the horse before answering. "Better than most men do." Ellie nodded seriously, as though that made perfect sense. Then she lifted the nearly empty bucket beside her feet and tried dragging it toward the south end of town. The bucket scraped loudly across the dirt because there was not enough water inside to make it heavy. The rider watched her struggle for several seconds before stepping forward and taking the handle without asking. "I can carry it," Ellie said, immediately embarrassed. "I know." Together they walked away from the crowd while Dry Creek continued buying survival one bucket at a time. Ellie's home sat near the edge of town beside an abandoned stable. The small wooden house leaned slightly to one side from years of wind damage. Inside, the air smelled faintly of medicine and dust. Ellie's mother lay sleeping beneath a thin blanket in the corner bed, her breathing shallow and uneven. The rider noticed bottles of old remedies scattered nearby, most of them empty. Illness spread quickly where water disappeared. "My mama used to teach at the schoolhouse," Ellie said softly, while setting the bucket near the table. "Before she got sick." The rider glanced toward the woman. Her cheeks were pale beneath sunburned skin, and dark circles sat beneath closed eyes. "Doctor?" he asked. Ellie shook her head. "Left town in spring." She tried saying it casually, but sadness cracked through the words anyway. Then came the moment that changed something inside the chapter. Ghost, who had remained outside until now, suddenly let out a low, uneasy sound from the porch. Not a frightened sound. A warning. The rider stepped outside immediately. Ghost stood rigid near the fence, staring west again toward the distant Harper Hills. But this time the horse wasn't merely looking. Its ears pinned backward, muscles tightening beneath black skin. Then slowly, Ghost pawed once at the dry ground near the fence line. The rider crouched. The dirt beneath the dust felt cool, not wet, cool. His eyes narrowed slightly. That should not have been possible. Not in a town this dry. He pressed his fingers deeper into the soil. Beneath the top layer of cracked earth, there was moisture hiding below. Ellie appeared in the doorway behind him. "What is it?" The rider stared west toward the hills shimmering beneath the heat. "Nothing yet," he said. But Ghost kept staring, and for the first time since arriving in Dry Creek, the rider stopped thinking about leaving. By afternoon, the heat became almost unbearable. Tempers worsened with it. A ranch hand accused his neighbor of stealing from his rain barrel during the night. Two brothers nearly shot each other behind the butcher shop over a missing water jug. Sheriff Hale spent most of the afternoon dragging angry men apart while Pike threatened anyone loud enough to challenge him. Sarah Bell's saloon filled with exhausted people trying to drink away thirst they could no longer afford to cure. The rider sat alone in the shade beside Ghost, quietly observing everything. Dry Creek was not dying because of drought alone. It was dying because fear had convinced everyone survival belonged only to themselves. Late in the day, Caleb Morris approached carrying 2 pieces of stale bread wrapped in cloth. The boy looked even thinner than yesterday. "Miss Bell said you paid extra for the horse water," he said awkwardly. "Figured maybe you hadn't eaten." The rider accepted the bread with a nod. Caleb hesitated before sitting beside him on the porch steps. "You really leaving tomorrow?" the boy asked. "That's usually how roads work." Caleb stared down the street toward the Harper station. People here used to help each other. His voice sounded older suddenly. Now everybody locks their doors before sunset. He kicked dust with one boot. "Sometimes I think the town's scared of itself." The rider looked at Ghost again. The horse still faced west, watching, waiting. As the sun disappeared behind the distant hills, Dry Creek grew quiet once more. But tonight the silence felt different, less exhausted, more tense, like something hidden beneath the town had begun moving in the dark, waiting for the right moment to rise. And somewhere beyond the Harper land, beneath all that dust and stone, the rider could almost swear he heard water flowing where no water should exist. The heat grew worse over the next 2 days, and Dry Creek began changing in ways that had nothing to do with weather. The town no longer moved like a community. It moved like a group of strangers trapped in the same burning room. Windows stayed shut even during daylight. People stopped greeting one another in the street. Men walked with rifles slung across their backs when they fetched water, and mothers pulled children indoors whenever arguments started, which was often now. Every conversation eventually turned toward the same fear. The water was disappearing faster than it should. The rider noticed it immediately. The line outside the Harper station stretched longer each morning while the barrels grew emptier. People whispered that somebody had begun stealing from the reserves during the night. Others believed the mountain spring had finally died. Nobody knew the truth, but uncertainty poisoned the town more effectively than thirst itself. Ghost sensed it too. The black horse had become uneasy since arriving in Dry Creek. It no longer rested properly at night, often lifting its head towards the western hills with ears sharply alert. Sometimes it pawed at the ground near the edge of town, snorting softly as though trying to uncover something hidden beneath the earth itself. The rider trusted the instincts of animals more than the words of men. Animals lied only when frightened. People lied whenever survival demanded it. That morning, Sheriff Tom Hale stood outside the water station trying to keep order, while sweat darkened the collar of his faded sheriff coat. His broad face looked older than it had 2 days earlier. Exhaustion had settled deep into him. The drought was aging everyone in Dry Creek, but it seemed to weigh especially heavily on men responsible for pretending things were still under control. Near the front of the line, 2 ranch hands accused each other of stealing water from a storage shed behind the blacksmith's shop. One of them, a wiry man named Curtis Wynn, had sharp cheekbones, a crooked nose from an old bar fight, and restless brown eyes that never stopped moving. Curtis had once worked cattle along the Rio Grande before a broken leg ended his ranching career. Since then, he survived through odd jobs and gambling, which made him both desperate and difficult to trust. The other man, Joseph Pike, not related to Deputy Pike, was larger, slower, and visibly exhausted, with a thick beard covering half his face and skin burned nearly red from years in the sun. Joseph rarely argued with anyone under normal circumstances, but thirst had started scraping away whatever patience remained in decent people. "You took from my barrel," Curtis snapped. Joseph shook his head. "I ain't risking a bullet over 2 cups of water." "Funny," Curtis muttered, gripping his revolver belt. "That's exactly what a thief would say." Sheriff Hale stepped between them before either man could move further. "Enough." His voice carried force this time, though mostly because he sounded close to breaking himself. "Nobody's drawing guns over water in my town." Nobody answered him. That frightened him more than shouting would have. People no longer argued because they respected the law. They stopped because they were too tired to continue. The rider watched from across the street beside Sarah Bell's saloon porch. Sarah stood near him, smoking silently, her dark eyes following the crowd with increasing concern. "Seen drought before," she said eventually. "But this—" She exhaled smoke toward the empty road. "This feels different." "How?" "Folks ain't scared of dying anymore." She glanced toward the line. "They're scared somebody else might live longer than they do." The rider said nothing because she was right. Inside the saloon, voices remained low. Men sat separately now instead of sharing tables. A gambler hid a water flask beneath his coat every time someone entered. 2 women argued quietly over whose child deserved medicine more. Even laughter sounded guilty in Dry Creek. Around noon, the rider saw Ellie again. She crossed the street carrying her small wooden bucket, moving carefully through the dust as if trying not to spill what little remained inside. Her cream-colored dress looked dirtier than before, and shadows had formed beneath her young eyes from sleepless nights caring for her mother. Yet she still walked with stubborn determination, refusing help unless absolutely necessary. Ghost noticed her before the rider did. The horse stepped toward the girl slowly and lowered its head near the bucket. Ellie smiled faintly and scratched behind Ghost's ear. "He likes you," she whispered. Ghost huffed softly through his nose. The rider leaned against the hitching rail nearby. "He tolerates most people." Ellie glanced into the bucket. There was barely enough water inside to cover the bottom. "You should keep that," the rider said quietly. "It's for my mama. You need it too." Ellie looked away for a moment. That was when he saw it. The hesitation. The guilt. That evening after sunset painted the town in dull orange light, the rider passed Ellie's house while returning from the stable. Through the cracked window, he saw the small girl kneeling beside the bucket near her mother's bed. Her mother slept restlessly beneath sweat-soaked blankets, breathing unevenly in the darkness. Ellie looked at the cup in her trembling hands for a very long time. Then, slowly, she drank from it. Only a mouthful, barely more than a sip. But the moment the water touched her lips, tears filled her eyes. She covered her mouth immediately afterward as if ashamed of her own survival. "I'm sorry," she whispered toward her sleeping mother. "I'm sorry." The rider stood motionless outside the window. Something inside him shifted. Not dramatically, not enough to show on his face, but enough. Because suddenly Ellie was no longer just another child in another dying town. For one brief second, in the shaking guilt of that little girl drinking water, she believed belonged to someone else. He remembered another face from long ago, a memory buried so deep he normally kept it locked away, beneath miles of silence and dust. A child crying beside a sickbed, a dry summer, a promise he had failed to keep. Ghost suddenly lifted its head beside the porch. The horse stared west again. Then came the rehook moment. Without warning, Ghost jerked hard against the hitching post and let out a sharp, aggressive sound. The rider had never heard from him before. Not fear, recognition. The black horse began pulling toward the western road so violently the woodrail creaked beneath the strain. The rider moved instantly, grabbing the reins. Ghost's entire body had gone rigid. Its nostrils flared wide. Then the rider heard it too, very faint, very distant, a sound beneath the wind. Water, not imagined this time. Flowing, the rider slowly turned toward the dark western hills. At the same moment, he noticed another detail. The breeze coming from that direction felt cooler, moist, impossible. Behind him, Ellie stepped quietly onto the porch, wiping tears from her cheeks before anyone could notice. "Your horse keeps looking there," she whispered. The rider's eyes narrowed beneath the shadow of his hat. "Yeah. Why?" He stared into the darkness beyond Dry Creek. "I think he smells something the rest of us don't." The next morning, the town finally began cracking apart. A storage barrel behind the butcher shop had been broken open during the night. Nearly half the water inside was gone. Nobody knew who took it. Nobody trusted anyone enough to believe innocence anymore. By sunrise, accusations spread through Dry Creek like wildfire. Curtis Wynn claimed Joseph Pike stole it. Joseph blamed drifters passing through town. A woman accused her own cousin. Deputy Earl Pike started searching homes without permission, kicking open doors and dumping personal belongings into the dirt while claiming he was protecting public order. Sheriff Hale tried stopping him twice before giving up entirely. Every hour seemed to drain more authority from the old lawman's voice. The rider watched the chaos carefully, people were no longer thinking clearly. Fear was hurting them exactly where someone wanted them. That realization stayed with him through the rest of the morning. So did the memory of cool earth beneath the western soil. And Ghost never once stopped staring toward Harper Land. By evening, small armed groups had begun forming quietly around town. Men gathered in corners, whispering about raiding the Harper reserves directly. Others talked about leaving Dry Creek altogether before things turned bloody. Sarah Bell locked the saloon doors earlier than usual and loaded a shotgun behind the counter. Dry Creek had not become violent yet, but violence had arrived in spirit, and everyone could feel it, waiting just outside town like a storm building behind the hills, including the rider, including Ghost. And somewhere far to the west, hidden beyond dust and rock and lies, water continued flowing in the dark. The wind changed that night, not stronger, not colder, different. The rider noticed it while standing outside Sarah Bell's saloon beneath a sky cloudless and cruelly beautiful. Dry Creek had fallen quiet earlier than usual, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of people waiting for something terrible to happen first to someone else. Lamps flickered weakly behind boarded windows. Somewhere down the street, a husband and wife argued in exhausted whispers over whether to leave town before the week ended. A baby cried briefly, then stopped so suddenly it unsettled him more than the crying itself. Ghost stood beside the hitching rail, staring west again. Always west. The black horse had barely eaten all evening. Every few minutes its ears twitched toward the distant hills beyond Harper Land, muscles tightening beneath its dark coat like wires pulled too tight. The rider rested one gloved hand against the horse's neck and felt tension running through the animal. "You hear it again?" Sarah Bell asked from the saloon doorway. She leaned against the frame with a lantern in one hand and a shotgun resting casually beneath the other arm. The warm light revealed new exhaustion in her face. She had started locking the saloon before dark now, something she once swore she would never do. Dry Creek had changed even her. The rider glanced toward the hills. "Maybe." Sarah studied him carefully. "You planning to chase ghosts out there?" A faint shadow of amusement touched his face at the name. "Already got one." For the first time in days, Sarah almost smiled. Then the sound of breaking glass echoed from somewhere deeper in town. Both of them turned immediately. Two drunk ranch hands staggered outside the barber shop, shoving each other violently while several others watched from the shadows without intervening. Sheriff Hale appeared moments later, moving slower than he used to, but still carrying enough authority to stop bloodshed before it started. Deputy Pike followed behind him with visible eagerness, hand already resting on his revolver. The rider watched the scene for only a few seconds before turning back toward Ghost. The horse was still staring west, waiting. That settled it. An hour later, after the town finally quieted again, the rider saddled Ghost beneath the cover of darkness. He carried no lantern. Moonlight was enough for men who preferred not to be seen. The western trail climbed gradually beyond Dry Creek, through broken hills covered in dry brush and scattered rock. The land looked dead at first glance, but the farther they rode, the more details began bothering him. Small details, easy to miss unless you spent years surviving outdoors. Certain patches of dirt remained darker than they should. A cluster of grass near a stone ridge still held traces of green. Even the night air felt cooler here. Ghost noticed everything before he did. The horse lowered its head often, sniffing near the ground while moving uphill with unusual certainty, as though following a scent invisible to human senses. The rider dismounted near a narrow canyon pass and crouched beside the earth. He dug his fingers into the dirt. Moisture, not much, but enough. His eyes narrowed beneath the shadow of his hat. That was impossible. Dry Creek should have been bone dry this far west. Ghost suddenly stopped moving. The horse stared ahead into darkness. Then came the rehook moment. A faint sound drifted through the canyon, children laughing. The rider froze. The sound lasted only a second before disappearing into the wind, but it struck him hard enough to tighten his chest painfully. Ghost shifted uneasily beside him. The rider knew that laughter. Not truly, not logically, but memory did not care about logic. For one dangerous moment standing alone beneath moonlight and stone, he was no longer in Dry Creek. He was years younger, standing outside another house during another dry summer, hearing another child laugh before sickness took the sound away forever. The memory vanished quickly, but not before leaving damage behind. The rider exhaled slowly and continued forward. The canyon eventually opened into higher ground, overlooking the western valley beyond Harper Ranch territory. That was when he saw it. Water. Real water. Moonlight reflected across a narrow stream hidden beneath the hills, flowing silently through a man-made channel cut carefully into the rock. Pipes extended downhill from the stream toward a concealed pumping station partially hidden beneath wooden coverings and brush. Dry Creek had never truly run out of water. Someone had redirected the mountain spring. The rider remained motionless for several seconds, absorbing the scale of what he was seeing. Ghost snorted sharply behind him. Then another voice spoke from the darkness. "You're either very brave or very stupid." The rider turned slowly. An older man stepped out from beside the pumping station carrying a lantern. He was tall despite his age, with silver hair combed neatly beneath a black western hat, and sharp features weathered more by responsibility than labor. His beard was trimmed close to the jaw, and his dark coat looked expensive compared to anything in Dry Creek. Even standing alone in the dust, he carried himself like someone accustomed to being obeyed. Ezra Harper, the man behind the water. Two armed ranch guards stood several feet behind him near the ridge, hands resting near rifles but not raised yet. Ezra studied the rider calmly. "You followed the horse," he said. The rider said nothing. Ezra looked toward Ghost with surprising admiration. Smart animal. Smarter than most men. That earned the faintest smile from the older rancher. Up close, Ezra Harper did not resemble the monsters people whispered about. Inside Dry Creek, there was intelligence in his eyes, weariness too. He looked less like a villain and more like a man who had spent years carrying decisions nobody else wanted. "You're wondering why," Ezra said quietly. The rider glanced toward the flowing stream. "Town's dying while this runs free." Ezra's expression hardened slightly. "No," he corrected, "the town's surviving because this runs free." The rider remained silent. Ezra walked slowly toward the edge of the ridge, overlooking Dry Creek far below. The lantern light cast long shadows across his face. 20 years ago, this place nearly starved," he said. "No rain, no cattle. Men robbed each other in daylight. Families disappeared overnight." His jaw tightened slightly at the memory. People love talking about freedom until hunger arrives. Then freedom becomes panic. The rider listened without interrupting. "I saved this town once," Ezra continued. "Bought food with my own money. Opened my ranch wells to everyone. And do you know what happened?" He looked back sharply. "People took until there was nothing left. Weak men become animals faster than you'd believe." The rider's eyes shifted toward the hidden water channels. "So now you control it. Now I ration it." Ezra's voice remained calm, but conviction burned beneath every word. "Fear keeps people civilized," he said. "Without order, Dry Creek tears itself apart in a week." The rider thought about the fights. The locked doors, children stealing water, neighbors accusing neighbors. Part of Ezra Harper was right. That was what made him dangerous, not cruelty, belief. Ghost suddenly pawed at the ground near one of the supply sheds. The rider noticed several cattle nearby in fenced pasture land. Healthy cattle, strong. Their troughs were full. Another detail, too full. Ezra followed his gaze. "I protect what belongs to my ranch," he said coldly, "and let the town rot." Ezra looked toward Dry Creek again. The town was rotting long before the drought. Silence settled between them. Wind moved through the canyon softly now, carrying the sound of flowing water everywhere. The rider realized something then. Ezra Harper truly believed he was the only thing standing between Dry Creek and chaos. Maybe once he had been. But power changed men quietly, especially men convinced they were necessary. One of the guards finally stepped forward nervously. He was younger than the others, perhaps 25, with nervous eyes and fresh scars along his neck from an old cattle accident. "Mr. Harper," he muttered carefully, "we shouldn't leave him here." Ezra raised one hand slightly, silencing him without effort. Then the older man looked back toward the rider. "You seem intelligent enough to understand reality," Ezra said. "Dry Creek needs control more than hope." The rider rested one hand against Ghost's saddle. "No," he said quietly. The wind shifted again. Ghost lifted its head. Below them, far in the darkness, Dry Creek sat silent beneath the dying land, like a town already halfway buried. "What it needs," the rider said, "is truth." Ezra Harper's expression changed for the first time. Not anger, concern, real concern, because somewhere deep down, even he knew truth was harder to control than lies. By the next morning, Dry Creek no longer felt like a town waiting to collapse. It felt like one breath away from violence. The heat arrived early again, crawling over the streets before sunrise and trapping the smell of dust, sweat, and fear beneath the still air. Men gathered in tight circles outside boarded buildings, speaking in low voices that stopped whenever strangers approached. Women carried buckets with both hands now, eyes constantly scanning the street. Even children had grown quieter. They no longer played in the open road. They watched from porches instead, learning too young what desperation looked like in adult faces. The rider returned from the western hills shortly after dawn, with Ghost moving heavily beneath him. The black horse looked exhausted from the night ride, though its ears still twitched sharply toward Harperland every few seconds, as if the animal could feel tension building before humans could. Dust coated both horse and rider so completely they looked carved from the same hard desert. Sarah Bell spotted him first. She stood outside the saloon, replacing cracked window boards damaged during the previous night's fighting. Her sleeves were rolled past strong forearms darkened by years beneath western sun, and loose silver strands escaped her tied-back hair. She studied the rider's expression carefully as he dismounted. "You found something," she said quietly. The rider tied Ghost to the rail. "Yeah." Sarah waited, but he said nothing more. That answer worried her more than words would have. Across town, shouting erupted near the Harper station. A crowd had gathered around a wagon overturned beside the waterline. Two men wrestled violently in the dirt, while others screamed accusations over them. Sheriff Hale pushed through the crowd, trying to separate people before guns appeared. But exhaustion slowed him now. The old lawman looked like a man carrying a town on shoulders, no longer strong enough for the weight. Then someone screamed. The crowd shifted instantly. The rider turned toward the sound. Near the station fence stood a man clutching his stomach, blood running through his fingers onto the dust below. His name was Walter Green, a thin ranch worker in his 40s with sunken cheeks and rough hands permanently stained by labor. Walter had spent most of his life hauling lumber and repairing fences around Dry Creek. People trusted him because he rarely spoke badly about anyone. His wife had died during winter fever 3 years earlier, leaving him alone to raise a 7-year-old son named Ben. Now Walter staggered backward in shock while Deputy Earl Pike stood several feet away, holding a smoking revolver. For one terrible second, nobody moved. Then Walter collapsed. Ben Green broke through the crowd immediately. The small boy fell beside his father in the dirt, crying hard enough to shake his whole body. Walter tried speaking, but blood filled his mouth before words could form. The rider saw Sheriff Hale kneel beside the dying man, horror spreading slowly across the old sheriff's face. "What happened?" Sarah whispered beside him. Nobody answered, because everyone already understood. Walter had tried stealing water, and Pike had shot him for it. Deputy Pike's pale face looked almost sick now, though he kept gripping the revolver tightly, as if refusing to admit fear. "He came at me," he shouted toward the crowd. "He reached for my gun." "That's a lie," someone yelled back. Another voice joined in, then another. The crowd surged forward. Sheriff Hale stood quickly, raising both hands. Everybody back, but nobody listened anymore. Not after seeing a father die over water. Ben Green clung to Walter's body, crying uncontrollably, while blood soaked into the dust beneath them. The rider watched the boy's face and felt something old and bitter move through his chest again, that familiar anger he spent years trying to bury beneath silence. Ghost suddenly jerked hard against the hitching rail. The horse let out a sharp warning sound and pawed violently at the ground. Then came the rehook moment. As the crowd screamed around the dead man, Ghost turned directly toward Harperland and began pulling so hard the wooden rail snapped apart completely. The horse did not run. It stopped in the middle of the street, staring west, waiting. And in that strange, frozen moment, while Dry Creek balanced on the edge of chaos, several people followed the horse's gaze, toward the hills, toward Harper Land, toward something hidden. The rider saw realization beginning to spread, not full understanding yet, but instinct. The same instinct Ghost had felt since arriving. Something out there was wrong, very wrong. Deputy Pike noticed the shift in the crowd too. Panic flickered across his face. He raised the revolver again. "Everybody get back. Wrong move." Curtis Wynn stepped forward first, rage twisting his sharp features. "You murdered him." Others moved behind him. More shouting erupted. Sheriff Hale grabbed Pike's arm roughly. "Put the damn gun down." But fear had already destroyed whatever little control remained. The rider stepped forward at last. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough. People noticed anyway, because even angry crowds recognized calm when they saw it. "What are you waiting for?" Curtis shouted toward him. "You know something." The rider looked toward Harper Land again, then at Walter Green's body lying in the dirt beside his son. Finally, he spoke. "There's water in the hills." Silence hit the street harder than gunfire. Nobody moved. Even Pike stopped breathing for a second. Sheriff Hale stared at him carefully. "What did you say?" The rider met the sheriff's exhausted eyes. "The town ain't dry." The word spread through the crowd like wildfire. People began shouting instantly. Lies, questions, hope, anger, fear. The rider ignored all of it and walked toward Ghost. "Follow me," he said quietly. That was all. And somehow it was enough. The crowd moved after him, not because they trusted him completely, but because desperate people followed any man who sounded certain. Dry Creek emptied into the western road beneath the brutal afternoon heat. Men carried rifles, women carried buckets. Sheriff Hale rode beside the front, trying desperately to prevent bloodshed, while Deputy Pike stayed behind, pale and trembling beside the station. Ghost led naturally. The black horse walked with strange confidence toward the hills, ears forward, muscles tense beneath dark skin. The rider barely touched the reins. As the town climbed higher into the western canyon, people slowly began noticing the signs for themselves. Cooler air, green patches hidden between rocks, damp soil beneath dry dust. Whispers spread through the crowd. Then they heard it. Water. Real water. By the time they reached the ridge overlooking the hidden stream, the entire town had fallen silent again. Below them, moonlight reflected across flowing water, hidden behind the canyon walls. Pipes stretched from the stream toward Harper Ranch storage tanks. Barrels stood full beneath covered sheds, while Dry Creek starved below. Nobody spoke at first, because betrayal that large took time to become real inside the human mind. Then someone began crying. Another man cursed loudly. A woman dropped to her knees beside the water itself. The crowd exploded. Men surged downhill toward the pumping station, shouting Harper's name, with murder in their voices. Ranch guards appeared near the sheds, raising rifles nervously, while Ezra Harper stepped from the station porch, with rigid calm still written across his face. But even he looked shaken now, not by the truth, by how quickly truth became fury. Curtis Wynn grabbed a rope from one of the supply wagons. "Hang him!" someone screamed. Others joined immediately. Walter Green's death still hung over the crowd like smoke. The rider moved before things crossed the line forever. He stepped directly between Ezra Harper and the advancing townspeople. Several rifles pointed toward him instantly. "Move," Curtis warned. The rider didn't. His eyes swept slowly across the crowd, the grieving, furious, thirsty faces twisted by pain and vengeance. Then he spoke quietly. If thirst made him a monster, the canyon fell silent enough to hear water moving through stone. "Revenge will do the same to you." Nobody answered. Ben Green stood near the back beside Sheriff Hale, tears still drying across his dusty face. Sarah Bell lowered her shotgun first. Then Sheriff Hale removed his hand from his revolver. One by one, the shouting stopped. Not because forgiveness suddenly appeared, but because for the first time in months, Dry Creek stopped thinking like starving animals long enough to remember they were human beings. Even Ezra Harper understood it. You could see it in his eyes. The rider turned toward the flowing stream beside them. The water continued moving peacefully through the canyon, untouched by greed, fear, or violence, as if nature itself could not understand why men destroyed each other over gifts meant for everyone. The first sound was laughter, not shouting, not gunfire, not accusations carried through dry streets beneath a dying sun. Laughter. It echoed through Dry Creek the morning after the truth came out, soft at first, almost uncertain, as if the town itself had forgotten how human joy was supposed to sound. Then another voice joined it, then another. Children splashed beside reopened troughs, while water spilled through the streets in thin, muddy streams that glittered beneath the sunrise. For the first time in months, windows stood open. Dust no longer ruled every inch of the town. Even the air smelled different now, cooler, alive somehow, carrying traces of wet earth drifting down from the western hills. The small diversion dam hidden beyond Harperland had been broken apart before dawn, not destroyed violently. Opened. Sheriff Hale himself supervised the release after a long night beside the canyon stream. The old lawman looked 20 years older standing there in morning light, but strangely lighter too, as though telling the truth had finally removed a weight he had carried too long. Water rushed down the old natural channels toward Dry Creek again, flowing across stone paths that had sat empty for nearly a year. The rider watched everything from the porch outside Sarah Bell's saloon, while Ghost drank deeply from a full trough nearby. The black horse looked calmer now than at any point since arriving in town. Its ears no longer twitched constantly toward the hills, and its breathing had settled into slow, peaceful rhythm. Animals knew when danger passed long before humans allowed themselves to believe it. Sarah Bell stepped outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one toward the rider before leaning against the porch rail beside him. Sunlight revealed the exhaustion beneath her strong features, but it also revealed something else, returning slowly to her face. Hope. You know, she said quietly, watching children run through muddy water barefoot, I almost forgot what this place sounded like before all the fear. The rider took the cup without answering. A harmonica began playing somewhere near the stable road, weak at first, then stronger. Sarah looked toward the sound and laughed softly under her breath. Old man Fletcher, she said, hasn't touched that harmonica since his wife died. Across town, people cleaned porches and reopened storefronts that had remained shut for weeks. Women carried buckets openly without clutching them like weapons. Neighbors spoke to each other again without suspicion immediately hiding behind their eyes. Dry Creek still looked worn down by drought and anger, but something invisible had changed overnight. Fear no longer owned the town completely. Sheriff Hale walked slowly down the main street around midday. Without the constant tension of holding violence back, he suddenly looked every bit his age. His heavy shoulders sagged beneath the faded sheriff coat, and his gray mustache twitched slightly whenever someone thanked him as he passed. People still respected him, but now he seemed uncomfortable beneath it. The rider noticed that. So did Sarah. He blames himself, she murmured quietly. For what? For waiting too long. Sheriff Hale eventually stopped near the saloon porch. He removed his hat slowly, wiping sweat from his lined forehead before speaking. Up close, his tired eyes looked clearer than they had in days. I'm stepping down, he said simply. Sarah stared at him. Tom. He shook his head gently. No point pretending anymore. He glanced down the street toward the reopened water channels. A sheriff's supposed to protect people before fear turns them into something ugly. His jaw tightened briefly. I kept trying to keep order instead of asking why things were breaking. The rider said nothing, because Hale was right. The old sheriff looked toward him after a moment. You knew before the rest of us. I suspected, and still stayed. The rider's eyes drifted toward Ghost, standing in sunlight. Horse didn't want to leave. That earned the faintest smile from Hale. Smart horse. Before the conversation could continue, movement at the far end of town drew everyone's attention. Ezra Harper was leaving. 2 wagons rolled slowly through Dry Creek, carrying supplies, ranch documents, and armed guards. Ezra sat at the front of the lead wagon, wearing the same dark coat and black western hat from the canyon. But now the man looked smaller somehow, not defeated exactly, just older, like truth had finally forced him to see the damage caused by years spent believing fear was wisdom. People watched him pass in silence. No one cheered. No one attacked him. That mattered. The rider noticed Ezra looking toward the reopened water channels beside the road. His expression was unreadable until his eyes briefly settled on Ben Green standing beside Sarah Bell's porch. The boy still wore grief openly. Losing his father had hollowed something inside him. No child should lose so young. Ezra lowered his gaze after seeing him. For the first time since arriving in Dry Creek, he looked ashamed. Then the wagons continued westward until dust swallowed them entirely. The town remained silent long after. That was the rehook moment. Ghost suddenly lifted its head and stared after the disappearing wagons, but instead of tension or warning, the horse gave a slow, quiet breath through its nose and relaxed completely for the first time in the entire story, as if even the animal understood something had finally ended. The rider rested one hand gently against Ghost's neck, and for one strange second, while sunlight shimmered across moving water and the sound of children echoed through Dry Creek again, he felt something dangerous inside himself. Peace. Real peace. The feeling unsettled him more than violence ever did, because peace invited memory. and memory invited pain. Later that evening, Dry Creek gathered near the reopened troughs for the first real celebration the town had seen in months. Someone roasted meat over open fire pits while Old Man Fletcher played his harmonica from a wooden chair outside the general store. Fletcher was nearly 70, thin as fence wire, with white hair curling beneath a dusty cap and hands permanently shaking from age and years spent working railroad tracks. But tonight the harmonica steadied in his grip. Music had returned before strength had. Children ran freely through the muddy streets. One of them was Ellie. The little girl looked healthier already beneath the softer evening light. Her brown hair had been brushed properly for once, and color had returned slightly to her tired face now that her mother finally had clean water to drink. Still, she moved with the quiet awareness of someone who had seen too much hardship too young. The rider sat apart from the celebration near Ghost beneath the fading orange sky. He preferred distance. Distance made leaving easier. Ellie approached carefully, carrying something small in both hands. "I made this," she said softly. The rider looked down. Inside her palms rested a tiny cloth pouch tied shut with faded blue string. "What is it?" "Wildflower seeds." The rider frowned slightly. Ellie sat beside him near Ghost's saddle. "My mama says flowers used to grow near the creek before the drought." She looked toward the flowing water below town. "Maybe they will again." The rider turned the small pouch over slowly in his gloved hand. "So you remember this place?" Ellie whispered. Something tightened behind his ribs unexpectedly. Not pain exactly, something worse, attachment. He looked at the little girl beside him, then toward the town beyond her. People were laughing again, talking again, living again, and for the first time since arriving in Dry Creek, he understood something dangerous. Part of him wanted to stay. Ghost nudged lightly against his shoulder. The rider exhaled slowly. Then he reached up and tied the small pouch of seeds carefully to Ghost's saddle beside the bedroll and canteen. Ellie smiled. "You'll plant them someday?" The rider stared toward the dark horizon beyond Dry Creek. "Maybe." Night settled gently over the town afterward, not heavy and fearful like before, softer, warmer. The reopened water channels reflected moonlight through the streets while distant harmonica music drifted beneath the stars. People believed the worst had passed. Maybe they were right. But the rider had lived too long to mistake one peaceful night for permanence. Still, as Ghost rested quietly beside him and the small pouch of wildflower seeds swayed gently from the saddle in the evening wind, he allowed himself one brief, dangerous thought before sleep finally came. Maybe not every town was meant to stay broken forever. The town was asleep when the rider decided to leave. Not fully asleep. Dry Creek no longer slept the way frightened towns did, with one eye open and hands near loaded rifles. The fear had passed with the return of water, but after weeks of exhaustion and grief, people now slept deeply, like survivors finally trusting the night again. The streets were quiet beneath the last dark hour before dawn. Water flowed softly through the reopened channels beside the road, reflecting pale moonlight across wet stone. The dry wind that once carried dust now carried the faint smell of damp earth and wood smoke drifting from dying campfires. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once before settling again. Ghost stood near the stable behind Sarah Bell's saloon while the rider tightened the saddle straps beneath the dim lantern glow. The black horse remained calm and silent, though its dark eyes followed every movement carefully, as if sensing what was coming before any human could. The rider worked slowly, not because he needed time, because part of him no longer wanted the work finished. That bothered him more than anything else. He had stayed in Dry Creek longer than planned, longer than was safe. Towns were dangerous for men like him, Not because of bullets, but because people eventually started looking at you like you belonged somewhere. And belonging always came with a cost. Ghost nudged gently against his shoulder. The rider rested one hand against the horse's neck for a moment. "You're getting attached too," he muttered quietly. The horse breathed softly through its nose. A stable door creaked behind them. Sarah Bell stepped into the lantern light, wearing a dark wool shawl over her shoulders against the cold morning air. Without the noise of the saloon around her, she looked older tonight. Smaller, too, somehow. The strength was still there in the sharp lines of her face, and the steady confidence in her posture, but loneliness had become easier to see, now that the town was healing. Strong people often looked strongest while carrying pain. "You leaving before sunrise?" she said softly. Not a question. The rider continued checking Ghost's saddle. Roads easier before the heat. Sarah leaned against the stable wall, watching him quietly. "You always find excuses that sound practical." He almost smiled at that. Almost. "I ain't much good at goodbyes." "That's because goodbyes require caring." The rider paused briefly. Sarah noticed. That was enough. She walked closer and handed him a small wrapped bundle tied in cloth. "Food," she explained. "For the road." The rider looked down at it but didn't immediately take it. "You don't owe me anything." Sarah gave him a tired look. "People don't always give things because somebody owes them." After a moment, he accepted the bundle. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Sarah finally asked the question that had been hanging in Dry Creek ever since the water returned. "You could stay." The rider looked away toward the dark, empty street beyond the stable. Inside the silence between them sat all the dangerous things neither wanted to say aloud. The town trusted him now. Children smiled when Ghost passed by. People looked less afraid when he stood nearby. Dry Creek had begun making space for him. That was exactly why he needed to leave. "I'm not built for staying," he said quietly. Sarah studied his face beneath the shadow of the hat. "No," she replied after a long pause. "I think maybe you were just hurt by it once." That landed harder than he expected. For a moment, another memory flashed behind his eyes. Warm sunlight, laughter, a woman standing in a doorway somewhere long buried by time. The image vanished before he could hold on to it. Ghost suddenly lifted its head toward the eastern road. The horse's ears twitched sharply. Then came the rehook moment. At first, the rider thought someone was approaching town, but no footsteps followed, no wagon wheels, no voices, only wind. Yet Ghost continued staring into the darkness with complete focus. The rider stepped forward slowly beside the horse. Then he saw it. Far beyond Dry Creek, barely visible against the fading night horizon, wildflowers had begun growing beside the reopened creek bed. Tiny patches of pale color spread through the dark soil where water had returned only days earlier. Impossible, too fast, but real. For several silent seconds, neither man nor horse moved. Sarah eventually stepped beside him and saw them too. "Well," she whispered softly, "would you look at that?" The rider's eyes drifted toward the small pouch of seeds tied to Ghost's saddle. Hope traveled faster than people believed sometimes. The moment passed quietly. Then the rider climbed into the saddle. Ghost shifted beneath him with familiar ease. The eastern sky had begun turning gray now. Dawn was close. Sarah folded her arms against the cold. "You know," she said, "Dry Creek's probably the first town in years that won't remember you as a gunman." The rider adjusted his gloves slowly. "How will they remember me then?" Sarah thought about it, then smiled faintly. "As the fool who taught people water mattered less than each other." He shook his head once beneath the shadow of the hat. "They taught themselves." The rider gently turned Ghost toward the road leading out of town. For 1 second, he considered leaving without another word. That would have been easier, but before he could move, footsteps came racing through the street behind him. Small, fast footsteps. Ellie. The little girl nearly slipped running across the wet dirt road barefoot, breathing hard from trying to catch him before sunrise. Her hair was loose and messy from sleep, and she still wore the oversized cream-colored sweater she often used as a blanket during colder nights. But her eyes were wide awake. "You were really going to leave without saying goodbye?" she demanded between breaths. The rider looked down at her from the saddle. "Was trying to." Ellie frowned angrily, though sadness already trembled beneath it. Ghost lowered its head gently toward her. The horse always softened around the girl. That alone told the rider more than words could. Ellie reached into her pocket nervously. "I made something else." She handed him a small carved wooden flower, no bigger than his palm. It was rough and uneven, clearly carved by inexperienced hands, but carefully made. "My mama helped a little," she admitted quietly. The rider stared at the carving longer than necessary. People had given him money before, whiskey, bullets, supplies, but almost nobody gave him things meant to be remembered. "Thank you," he said finally. Ellie folded her arms tightly. "Why do you always leave?" The question landed differently coming from a child, because children asked honestly. No suspicion, no hidden meaning, no manipulation, just truth. The rider looked toward the horizon, where the first pale red light of dawn had begun spilling slowly across the desert. Very far away, coyotes called across the empty land. For a long time, he didn't answer. Then quietly, "Because staying hurts more." Ellie looked confused by that. Good. Some things children should not understand too early. The rider gave Ghost a gentle nudge forward. The black horse began walking slowly down the muddy road, leaving Dry Creek behind. No dramatic farewell followed. No speeches. Just the soft sound of hoofbeats fading into morning light. Ellie stood motionless beside Sarah Bell, watching the rider disappear toward the open desert. As the rising sun painted the land gold and red, the rider became smaller against the horizon until eventually he looked less like a man and more like part of the landscape itself. A shadow moving endlessly between broken places. The camera of memory lingered one final moment on Ghost's saddle, where the tiny pouch of wildflower seeds swayed gently beside the newly carved wooden flower, two small symbols of hope, still traveling with a man who no longer believed he deserved any for himself. And far behind him, Dry Creek continued waking beneath the sound of flowing water, alive again. Sometimes God does not send miracles the way we expect. Sometimes the miracle is not the rain, but the person who arrives before everything falls apart. Dry Creek was dying from thirst, but the real danger was what fear was turning people into. And maybe that is true in real life too. Hard times can dry out kindness, hope, and mercy long before they destroy anything else. But even in the darkest places, God can still use ordinary people to remind others how to be human again. The rider never stayed long enough to be called a hero. He simply chose compassion when revenge would have been easier. And maybe that is the lesson this story leaves behind. Sometimes the strongest people are not the ones who fight the hardest, but the ones who refuse to let pain turn them cold. If this story touched your heart, tell us where you are watching from in the comments. Share this story with someone who may need hope tonight. And if you enjoy emotional Western stories about faith, redemption, and humanity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ride with us into the next journey. May God bless you, protect your family, bring peace to your home, and guide you safely through every hard season ahead.